to stand before the colossal architecture of the new kingdom is to witness an empire attempting to conquer time itself. For over a millennium, the pharaohs commanded the very earth to rise in their image, forging a landscape where stone seemed to obey the will of a single sovereign. They built not merely to house their deities, but to immortalize their own reigns, believing they could tether the eternal to the mortal realm. Yet, beneath the gold and the granite lay a profound human fragility. This is the chronicle of a formidable civilization and the rulers who ultimately discovered that even gods must yield to the sands.
Before there were temples, before there were pharaohs to command the stone, there was only the river. The Nile was the singular, pulsing artery of life in an unforgiving void. To the east and west lay the Deshret, the Red Land, vast, silent oceans of arid desert that shielded the Nile Valley from the chaotic incursions of the outside world. This geographical isolation birthed a unique psychological certainty. Every year, the river swelled and inundated the banks, depositing a thick, incredibly fertile silt. They called their home Kemet, the Black Land. This rhythmic, predictable salvation instilled within the Egyptian consciousness a deep-seated belief in cosmic order, a fundamental principle they named Maat. Maat was the delicate equilibrium of truth, justice, and harmony that held the universe together, staving off the primordial chaos. And the burden of maintaining this cosmic balance fell squarely upon the shoulders of one mortal vessel, the pharaoh. He was not merely a king, he was a living god, the terrestrial incarnation of Horus, tasked with an impossible divine mandate. He had to physically manifest the eternal perfection of the heavens upon the muddy banks of the earth. From the nascent days of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, where the first monumental stone structures pierced the horizon, the governing philosophy was uncompromisingly established. To rule was to build was to survive. The state did not exist to serve the individual citizen. The individual existed to serve the state's monumental pursuit of eternity. A vast, intricate bureaucracy of viziers, scribes, and overseers was developed, not for social welfare, but to meticulously record the height of the inundation, calculate the grain yields, and subsequently mobilize the population for the colossal public works required by the gods. By the dawn of the New Kingdom, around 1550 BCE, this philosophy had evolved into a sophisticated imperial machine. The traumatizing occupation of northern Egypt by the foreign Hyksos rulers had shattered the illusion of the Nile's invulnerability. In response, a newly militarized state arose from the southern capital of Thebes. Pharaohs like Thutmose III transformed Egypt from an isolated kingdom into a formidable superpower, pushing its borders outward into the lucrative territories of the Levant and southward deep into the resource-rich heart of Nubia. Torrents of gold, cedarwood, lapis lazuli, and prisoners of war flowed relentlessly into the capital. This was the absolute zenith, the golden age, an era of unprecedented prosperity. And every ounce of this newfound imperial wealth was funneled into a single ravenous industry, the economy of the eternal. The colossal temple complex of Karnak, dedicated to the supreme state god Amun-Ra, became the epicenter of the known world. It was not a static, silent monument, but a sprawling, bustling metropolis of religious devotion and economic administration. Imagine the sheer deafening scale of the labor required to sustain this illusion. thousands upon thousands of artisans, stonemasons, scribes, and priests operated in a strictly codified hierarchy. The air of the quarries vibrated with the rhythmic, echoing strikes of bronze chisels upon blinding white limestone and unyielding red granite. The dust of creation hung thick in the air, catching the brilliant, relentless Egyptian sun as colossal obelisks weighing hundreds of tons were dragged onto massive barges to be floated down the Nile. We often picture the ruins of Egypt as barren, monochromatic stone, but at the height of the New Kingdom, these temples were a deliberate assault on the senses. The towering, claustrophobic papyrus columns of the hypostyle halls were meticulously plastered and painted in vibrant, saturated hues of malachite green, lapis blue, and ochre red. Enormous flags of pure white linen snapped in the hot wind atop soaring cedar masts, while the air within the deeply shadowed sanctuaries grew thick with the intoxicating, heavy smoke of imported myrrh and frankincense. It was a physical, sensory manifestation of absolute divine power. On the western bank of the Nile, hidden within the desolate, sun-baked ravines, lay the Valley of the Kings. Here, the economy of death reached its most intimate and exhaustive peak. In the guarded, highly secretive artisan village of Deir el-Medina, generations of highly skilled craftsmen lived their entire lives with one singular, monumental purpose: to carve and paint the subterranean mansions of the dead pharaohs. They mapped out the perilous journey of the soul through the underworld with terrifying precision, transforming the dark, claustrophobic bedrock into luminous, golden corridors of eternal life. This was a sophisticated society where a vast percentage of the gross domestic product was entirely consumed by the preparation for the afterlife. The state granaries overflowed. The Nile dutifully provided the inundation, and the pharaohs sat in their incense-filled sanctuaries, draped in heavy gold, utterly convinced that their mastery over stone equated to a mastery over time itself. Yet within this magnificent golden machinery lay the fatal seeds of its own destruction. The fundamental flaw of the New Kingdom was a quiet, creeping hubris, born of severe institutional overextension. As successive pharaohs poured unquantifiable wealth into the construction of greater and more elaborate monuments, they inadvertently transferred their own sovereign power to the priesthoods that managed these sprawling temple estates. The cult of Amun at Karnak grew from a religious institution into an untouchable economic leviathan. At its height, the priesthood controlled vast swathes of Egypt's most arable land, immense fleets of trading vessels, and hundreds of thousands of subservient agricultural laborers. They became a state within a state, their high priests wielding an administrative influence that rivaled and occasionally eclipsed the living God upon the throne. The royal desperation to reclaim this fractured authority culminated in the infamous reign of Akhenaten, the heretic king who attempted to violently sever the power of Amun by relocating the capital to the desert and enforcing the exclusive worship of a single solar disk, the Aten. But you cannot rewrite the fundamental cosmology of an empire overnight. The sudden disruption to the spiritual and economic balance was catastrophic, leaving the administration in chaos and the empire culturally scarred. It was a profound institutional wound that the succeeding Ramesside dynasty attempted to cover up through sheer brute architectural force. Enter Ramesses II. Ramesses the Great, a monarch whose appetite for monumentalization bordered on the pathological. He did not merely build, he aggressively, relentlessly laid claim to the entire physical landscape. From the staggering rock-cut colossi of Abu Simbel in the deep south to the sprawling columned halls of the Ramesseum, he plastered his deeply carved cartouches across the Nile Valley, often ruthlessly usurping the painstakingly carved monuments of his predecessors. He waged incredibly costly, prolonged military campaigns against the formidable Hittite Empire in the north. He famously spun a near-disastrous, bloody stalemate at the Battle of Kadesh into a piece of monumental state propaganda, ordering the narrative of his solitary, divine victory to be carved deep into the temple walls across the nation. But royal propaganda, no matter how deeply etched in stone, cannot balance an overextended imperial ledger. The sheer compounding economic strain of funding perpetual frontier warfare while simultaneously sustaining the largest domestic construction boom in human history began to hollow out the national treasury. The pharaohs were spending wealth they had not yet harvested, relying on the momentum of the past to fund the monumental vanity of the present. The facade of absolute unbroken power remained awe-inspiring to the illiterate peasantry, but the structural integrity of the state apparatus was quietly fracturing beneath the weight of its own stone. The geopolitical climate of the Late Bronze Age was shifting violently, and the insulated, monumental state was fundamentally unprepared for the shock. The mysterious, violent confederation known as the Sea Peoples swept across the Mediterranean basin, devastating the old, interconnected networks of international trade and wiping out allied empires. Egypt managed to survive the onslaught, but the sheer military effort exhausted the state beyond recovery. The empire rapidly lost its lucrative, tax-yielding territories in the Levant, and the vital, steady flow of Nubian gold slowed to a mere trickle. The grand economy of eternity began to suffocate. The descent was not a sudden, dramatic apocalypse, but rather a slow, deeply melancholic unraveling. As the new kingdom fractured into the chaotic, divided centuries of the Third Intermediate Period, the central authority of the living God completely dissolved. The unified state broke apart, ruled concurrently by competing factions of priests in Thebes, Libyan chieftains in the delta, and eventually Kushite kings marching up from the south. The colossal state-sponsored building projects ceased entirely. The great, sprawling temple workshops at Karnak and Luxor, once buzzing with the orchestrated labor of thousands, fell profoundly, devastatingly silent. The monumental economy collapsed inward. We see the stark, unvarnished reality of this societal decay, not in dramatic battlefield accounts, but in the mundane, tragic administrative records of the era. Tomb robberies became an endemic, systemic crisis. The very descendants of the artisans who had lovingly, reverently crafted the royal necropolises were driven by crippling inflation and actual starvation to plunder the sacred gold of their ancestors. The state could no longer afford to protect the eternity it had so obsessively constructed. By the time the Ptolemaic dynasty, lineage of Macedonian Greeks, established after the sweeping conquest of Alexander the Great, took control of the throne, the ancient Egyptian civilization had essentially become a magnificent, hollow performance. The Ptolemies, ruling from the newly established cosmopolitan and distinctly Hellenistic coastal city of Alexandria, treated the ancient agricultural heartland of the Nile Valley not as a sacred realm, but as a highly lucrative, manageable estate. They did, indeed, fund the construction of massive, imposing temples, like those at Edfu and Dendera, meticulously copying the ancient architectural proportions and the deeply ingrained hieroglyphic traditions. But this was a calculated, entirely political theatre. It was a cynical, administrative masquerade designed to placate the powerful native priesthoods and maintain absolute control over the rural, tax-paying population. The pharaoh was no longer the divine central conduit of Maat. He was a Greek bureaucrat, extracting staggering quotas of grain and wealth to fund endless dynastic conflicts in the broader Hellenistic world. The vibrant intellectual heart of the empire had irreversibly moved away from the sacred, sun-baked stones of Thebes to the marble libraries, gymnasiums, and bustling multicultural harbours of Alexandria. The traditional temples, whilst visually spectacular, were devoid of the profound, singular spiritual conviction that had raised the Great Pyramids and the hypostyle halls. They were formidable structures, yes, but they were built by a foreign administration, merely imitating a conquered past. The native Egyptian populace grew increasingly impoverished, heavily taxed, and profoundly alienated from their Greek-speaking rulers. The grand ancient ceremonies continued. The incense was dutifully burned. The intricate chants were recited by rote. But the geopolitical reality was undeniable. Egypt was no longer the master of its own destiny. The shadow of a new, ruthlessly pragmatic superpower was stretching rapidly across the Mediterranean. Rome did not care for cosmic balance, nor did it respect the divine lineage of the sun. Rome cared only for grain shipments, taxable wealth, and absolute unforgiving strategic dominance. The final, definitive collapse of the Egyptian state was an intimately human tragedy, inextricably linked to the last, desperate geopolitical maneuvers of Cleopatra VII. She attempted to use her vast personal wealth, her undeniable intellect, and her empire's vital strategic position to navigate the deadly shifting currents of the Roman civil wars. But her political and romantic alliance with Mark Antony proved ultimately fatal. With their devastating naval defeat at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, the grand illusion was finally brutally shattered. The hardened Roman legions marched unopposed into Alexandria, and the 3,000-year-old institution of the pharaoh was officially, unceremoniously extinguished. Egypt, the great, proud, monumental civilization that had once sought to conquer time itself, was summarily reduced to the humiliating administrative status of a personal imperial province. It became the mere breadbasket of the Roman Empire, heavily exploited solely to feed the volatile plebeian mobs of Rome and fuel the endless mechanical expansion of a foreign emperor. The legacy of this slow, crushing collapse is etched directly into the very landscape of the modern nation. Without the boundless, dedicated patronage of the state apparatus, the ancient temples were systematically abandoned to the elements. The powerful priesthoods dwindled into irrelevance. The complex, sacred knowledge of the hieroglyphs was entirely forgotten, and the grand, walled sanctuaries were left completely undefended. The vibrant, pulsating colours that once breathed vibrant life into the cold stone were slowly scoured away by the relentless, abrasive desert winds. The heavy, monolithic stone roofs collapsed under the immense weight of time. The sand, infinitely patient and entirely inevitable, drifted steadily through the great hypostyle halls, burying the colossal statues of forgotten kings up to their granite necks. For over a millennium, these colossal monuments lay silent, vast, and completely incomprehensible to the generations of people that lived amongst them, their original purpose lost to the void. Today, as we wander through these sun-drenched ruins, We are rightfully struck by their formidable, almost superhuman scale, but we must analytically recognize them for what they truly are. They are not merely triumphs of ancient engineering or testaments to a glorious past. They are the petrified, crumbling remnants of a profound, tragic human hubris. The pharaohs marshaled the absolute entirety of their empire's vast wealth, blood, and immense labor in a desperate, obsessive bid to achieve literal immortality. They believed that by raising indestructible mountains of stone, they could secure their eternal dominion over the chaotic forces of the universe. Yet the sheer physical survival of their architecture stands in stark, melancholic contrast to the total obliteration of their world. The temples endured, but the complex society that built them, the frail men who commanded them, and the distant gods who resided within them have all faded irreversibly into the silent, echoing corridors of history. In their relentless, uncompromising quest to tether the eternal to the mortal realm, the rulers of ancient Egypt left behind the ultimate ironic testament to human fragility. They proved with absolute, monumental certainty that while stone may briefly weather the millennia, every empire, no matter how unimaginably magnificent, is merely a temporary disruption of the desert sands.